Et nous avons le grand honneur de recevoir ce soir Madame Dr Einat Wilf et Monsieur Adi Schwartz pour parler d'un livre passionnant que je trouve un livre culte sur le sujet israélo-palestinien qui est The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of Palestinian Dream has obstructed the path to peace. C'est celui-là. Et c'est un très bon livre qui explique d'une manière extrêmement claire les problèmes que nous rencontrons et pourquoi on n'a pas de paix au Moyen-Orient. Et je pense que le livre répond à exactement ce qui se passe et ce que nous rencontrons ce jour-ci. Et dans la perception du monde arabe, on avait toujours l'idée que si on ne règle pas le problème palestinien, il n'y aura pas de paix dans le Moyen-Orient. On commence à voir aujourd'hui que c'est différent, qu'on aura des arrangements, on a des arrangements de paix qui commencent à se construire dans le Moyen-Orient sans toucher d'une manière directe le problème palestinien. Oui, il y avait la question de l'annexion qui a été suspendue, mais néanmoins, à mon avis, ça c'est un avis personnel, ça va ramener finalement à une résolution aussi des problèmes palestiniens. Et c'est leur vision qui est fausse. Effectivement, quand je lis les Franz Bandar, qui était Bandar Ben Sultan, qui était l'ambassadeur de l'Arabie Saoudite en Amérique, qui dit que déjà en 2000, quand on lui a présenté les divers paramètres de Clinton, il a dit si Arafat le rejette, ce n'est pas une erreur, mais c'est un crime. Et effectivement, toutes les erreurs possibles et imaginables étaient commises. Nous sommes une association qui met sur son drapeau le fait que nous souhaitons une solution de 2 pays pour 2 peuples. Et effectivement, c'est la philosophie aussi qui partage nos 2 orateurs. Et je pense que ces initiatives de paix dans le Moyen-Orient vont finalement permettre d'arriver à cette solution et pas comme certains disent qu'ils sont en entrave à cette solution. Et le livre lui-même que nous voulons parler est écrit par 2 personnalités de premier plan. Dr Einat Wilf est une personne qui réfléchit énormément et qui parle sur les relations internationales, l'économie, l'éducation, le sujet d'Israël et le sionisme. Elle est une ancienne membre du Parlement israélien de 2010 à 2013, où elle a présidé la commission d'éducation et puis était membre de la commission de défense et affaires étrangères. Et elle participe dans divers autres groupes de réflexion et instituts importants comme Jewish People Policy Institute ou Washington Institute for the Middle East. Elle était conseillère de vice-premier ministre Shimon Peres et travaillait précédemment chez McKinsey. Et elle a écrit plusieurs ouvrages sur divers sujets, notamment politiques. Et c'est une personne que vous avez pu rencontrer dans la manifestation qu'on a organisée avec UN Watch le 19 mars 2019. Oui, c'est pas si longtemps. Et puis, M. Adi Schwartz est un chercheur, académicien, auteur, et beaucoup sur le sujet des conflits arabo-israéliens, et travaille avec l'université Bar-Ilan et un expert dans ces sujets, principalement sur le problème des réfugiés palestiniens et l'histoire des juifs des pays arabes, qui est un sujet assez analogue finalement à cela. Le livre décortique d'une manière extrêmement lucide et perspicace l'utilisation du problème palestinien et des réfugiés pour bloquer tout règlement, pour stigmatiser Israël. Et c'est devenu, à travers la création de l'UNRWA et tout ce qui est venu derrière elle quelque chose qui bloque le processus de paix du Moyen-Orient. Effectivement, je vous rappelle que le Conseil fédéral Ignacio Cassis a déclaré que UNRWA est une partie du problème et pas de la solution. Et naturellement, ce n'est pas la position officielle du Conseil fédéral. La semaine passée, le Conseil fédéral a approuvé le rapport du département fédéral des affaires étrangères concernant l'UNRWA, qui a été préparé par un des amis de notre association. Il y a un papier officiel sur le site de la FAE. Mais néanmoins, il y a des nuances, puisqu'ils ont d'abord dit qu'il y a des critiques concernant l'UNRWA et très souvent de son contexte politique, qu'il y a des raisons justifiées à ces critiques et que l'accroissement du nombre de réfugiés est quand même préoccupant. Et le rapport demande des réformes structurelles fondamentales dans l'UNRWA. Et la Suisse a limité son soutien à 2 ans à la place de 4, et en mettant comme condition que les réformes soient introduites et exécutées. Et à la fin de cette année, il y aura une décision concernant le budget de 2 prochaines années au niveau de soutien suisse. Et la Suisse, naturellement, est engagée pour une transparence totale et un contrôle des activités d'UNRWA, et notamment l'introduction de matériel d'études pour le combat contre l'antisémitisme, l'islamophobie et l'extrémisme. Ça, c'est quelque chose d'assez nouveau dans ces contextes. Ce n'est peut-être pas encore la position que nous souhaitons, mais c'est déjà un avancement. Et en ce qui concerne le livre, je vous recommande vivement de le lire et de l'acheter. Vous pouvez l'acheter sur Amazon en le commandant, ou à la librairie Place du Marché 1 à Carouge, l'ancienne bibliothèque de Madame Dicker, et vous pouvez effectivement le commander. Ils ont une possibilité de fournir. En ce qui concerne l'activité de notre association, nous sommes en plusieurs démarches. La première, c'est d'influencer la Suisse pour intervenir auprès du Conseil des droits de l'homme pour supprimer cet article 7 qui concerne exclusivement Israël au-delà des autres pays. L'interdiction par la Suisse de Hezbollah, qui est aujourd'hui un sujet que le Parlement devra, ou le gouvernement devra trancher, puisque l'Allemagne l'a fait, la Tchéquie l'a fait, l'Estonie l'a fait, d'autres pays. C'est important parce que ça permet de saisir des fonds qui sont ici, des subventions aux ONG palestiniens. Grâce à notre action, le nombre de bénéficiaires a baissé de 26 à 9, mais c'est toujours 9 qui posent pour certains problèmes. Et nous essayons d'agir au Parlement et au gouvernement pour diminuer cela et même proposer des propositions constructives. Et finalement, la position de la Suisse dans certaines votes à l'ONU, qui était à l'OMS par exemple, où elle a participé à une vote qui disait que Israël maltraite les femmes ou des choses comme ça, ou une autre vote pour le UN Economic and Social Council, où on a parlé de problèmes d'assistance à des femmes palestiniennes. Et nous considérons que c'est une incohérence dans la politique étrangère suisse, puis c'est d'autres départements que le département des affaires étrangères qui traitent ce genre de sujets. Et je pense que le Parlement va se pencher là-dessus pour coordonner la politique israélienne. Et avant de passer la parole à nos excellents orateurs, j'aimerais vous inviter à demander à vos amis qui n'ont pas pu assister à la conférence de pouvoir se connecter à YouTube pour pouvoir la suivre, puisqu'elle sera transmise en différé. Deuxièmement, si chacun de vous pourra nous amener un membre de plus pour qu'on agrandisse un peu nos rangs, on vous sera très reconnaissant. Et troisièmement, nous voudrions remercier Yair Avec, qui était notre secrétaire depuis le début de cette année et qui, pour des raisons personnelles, a dû quitter. et souhaiter la bienvenue à Anaël Arki, qui est responsable de communication et administration, qui a repris les flambeaux et qui a repris l'organisation de cette manifestation. Et nous lui souhaitons beaucoup de satisfaction et beaucoup de succès à nos côtés dans ces démarches. Et j'aimerais passer la parole à nos orateurs. Entre-temps, vous pouvez envoyer par le chat diverses questions que vous pouvez avoir. Et à la fin, on va essayer de choisir quelques-unes pour le poser aux orateurs et ils vont avoir le plaisir de nous répondre. Merci beaucoup. I summarized a bit what we are doing in Switzerland and the issues which concern our association today with our Swiss authorities. I gave a few words on your book, but you'll be in a position to speak better than me. And I recommend it to everybody to buy and read the book because I think it's a very important book for everybody who deals with this subject. And I pass you the floor and thank you very much and wish you a good continuation.
Merci Joël, bonsoir à tous. Je vais parler en anglais, mais si vous voulez la traduction en français, appuyez sur le bouton de Zoom. Okay, hi, so my name is Einat Wilf. Adi and I, we are the co-authors of The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. Now, I can say that by now I've spent about a decade of my life researching, thinking, debating, writing, and a lot of speaking on the issue of the Palestinian refugees. Now, for people who are concerned with the issue of the conflict, the path to peace, this is often considered a minor issue. Most of the discussion on the conflict is about settlements, occupation, Bibi Netanyahu. I mean, we focus on certain things. The issue of the Palestinian refugees gets very, very little attention. To the extent that it does get attention, people view it as one of the least important issues in terms of the things that stand between Israelis and Palestinians and the ability to make peace. And I want to make the case to you today, together with Adi, that not only is this the most important issue, it's probably the issue, the only issue that really explains why there is no peace, and it is the issue that needs to be addressed if we are to ever have peace. So I want to share with you how I reached the conclusion that this is the most important issue. Now, like most Israelis of the peace camp, I was definitely from my days as a teenager. I was a member of the Israeli Labor Party. I supported, I voted for the Israeli left as soon as I could vote. During the late 80s, the early 90s, when I became a young adult, I supported the main premise of the Israeli peace camp, which was very simple. Israel has a path to peace, and the path to peace is based on a very simple equation. Israel should hand over land, and in return, it will get peace. This was famously known as the Land for Peace formula. And it was very simple and very elegant. And it was very seductive in its simplicity. All that Israel had to do to get peace, the peace that eluded it in 1949 when its Arab neighbors refused to make peace with it after the war, the only thing that Israel needs to make peace is to hand over the land it acquired in 1967 in the Six-Day War. This means the Golan Heights in the north, the Sinai Peninsula in the south, and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in the center. Those lands acquired as an outcome of the Six-Day 1967 war, if Israel were to hand it over to its neighbors, it will have peace. Now, for a while, this seemed to work beautifully. Land for peace was the basis for our agreement with Egypt. Israel handed over the entire Sinai Peninsula, no settlements with all its resources. And just for a sense of scale, the Sinai was more than twice the size of Israel. Israel handed over down to the last square inch, and in return, it gets a peace agreement with Egypt. Now, more than 40 years later, we can have a very interesting discussion as to whether Egypt actually has peace with Israel. Did we really get peace in exchange for the land? But officially, there's a peace agreement, and it was in exchange for the land. Now, the 1990s were really the heyday of the Land for Peace formula. Everything we did in the 90s was governed by this idea. We negotiated with Syria over the Golan Heights. We signed a peace agreement with Jordan, made some small territorial changes after Jordan gave up its territorial claim to the West Bank. And of course, the highlight of the 90s were the direct negotiations with the PLO, with the Palestinians over the future of the West Bank and Gaza. And the feeling in the 90s was really one of euphoria. It was bam, bam, bam. The feeling was this domino of peace. Israel will hand over the land, and by the end of the 90s, Israel will have peace, the Paris vision of the new Middle East with all its neighbors. 2000 is the year when it culminates. The head of the Israeli Labor Party, the head of the Israeli peace camp, Ehud Barak, goes to Camp David. This is very symbolic. This is where peace was negotiated with Egypt. He puts on the table a proposal which was later codified in the Clinton parameters, which would have given the Palestinians a fully sovereign state, so an end to the occupation. So if we were being told that the reason we don't have peace is Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, this was going to end it. There were going to be no settlements. Settlements were either going to be dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land. So if you think the problem we don't have peace is settlements, those were not going to be a problem. The Palestinians were going to have a fully sovereign state, no occupation, no settlements. And the capital was going to be East Jerusalem. If you think Jerusalem is the problem, the capital was going to be East Jerusalem, including holy sites in the Old City. So everything that we were told is the obstacle to peace, occupation, settlements, East Jerusalem, all of that was going to be taken care of. All the Palestinians had to do was say yes. What do? Arafat walks away. Abu Mazen walks away in 2008 from a similar proposal by Ehud Olmert. And not only do they walk away to no criticism from their people, which means that by walking away from those opportunities, they were fulfilling what their people wanted. There was no one who was telling Arafat in 2000 or Abbas in 2008 who was telling them, are you crazy? We can have a state. We can have the occupation. Go back to the room. Go back to Camp David. Get back on that airplane and get us our state. There was no such criticism from among the Palestinians, which means that when Arafat and Abu Mazen walked away from the opportunity to have a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, no settlements, no occupation, and capital in East Jerusalem, that's not what the Palestinians wanted. And of course, the fact that it was followed by massive bloodshed and massacres in our street and suicide bombers really raised the question of what do the Palestinians want? Adi and myself, and like many in the Israeli peace camp, asked this very simple question. What do the Palestinians want? They clearly don't want the West Bank and Gaza. They don't want the end to the settlements. They don't want the end to the occupation. They don't want a capital in East Jerusalem. What do they want? And Adi and I both discovered independently and then together, we joined forces, that the answer was staring us in the face. The Palestinians were telling us what they wanted all the time. We just didn't listen, or when we did listen, we didn't take it seriously. What did they want? They wanted something that they called a right of return. which, as we'll explain and we explain in the book, is neither a legally sanctioned right, nor is about today return. The people who demanded were never in Israel and were never its citizens. But the right of return, just so we know what the Palestinians think it is the idea that millions of Palestinians, the lowest number being 5.5 million, the higher number being 9 million, Palestinians believe that millions of Palestinians possess a sacred, they call it a sacred, a holy right that supersedes the sovereignty of the state of Israel to settle inside Israel, thereby transforming Israel into an Arab-Palestinian country with a Jewish minority. This means that during all the years that Palestinians were negotiating with Israel based on the formula of two states, a two-state solution, the only two states they were imagining was a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and another Palestinian state in Israel. There was never a single moment throughout the negotiations when any Palestinian leader envisioned a peace by which the Jewish people are allowed to keep their sovereign state in any part of the land and in any borders. So our book details how we got to this point, how we got to the idea that millions of Palestinians believe that they possess a right of return into Israel, believe that they are still refugees from a war that ended more than 72 years ago. We talk about how the West, including Switzerland, continues to sustain this Palestinian dream of no Israel, of what they call Palestine from the river to the sea, how Switzerland, with its own money, every year sustains the Palestinian dream that Israel will one day disappear, while claiming to be a country that supports peace and two states. So we go through the entire history of that. We show how we got to this point. And ultimately, in our book, we offer solutions. And the solutions are very simple. We go into detail, but the message is very clear. If the West, if a country like Switzerland really wants to support peace, rather than just say that it supports peace, if it really wants to support peace, it needs to help Palestinians understand that the war of 1948 is over, that the state of Israel as the sovereign state of the Jewish people is here to stay, and that they can have their own state of Palestine next to Israel, but never instead of Israel. And for that, they have to forgo the idea that they are still refugees into the fifth generation. They have to understand that they do not possess a right of return into the sovereign state of Israel, and they need to move on to build a future for themselves next to Israel and not instead of it. Thank you. Adi?
Thank you and good evening. Good evening for joining us tonight. So what I would like to do is to tell you a little bit more about the book. In addition to arguments and telling the historical background and actually going back to the beginning of the conflict, we also detail a few personal stories or a few vignettes, if you want, that give a very good impression of how this entire refugee problem unfolded from the beginning, which was the 1948 war. So one of the chapters in the book, we detail the story of Musa Alami. And Musa Alami was a very famous Palestinian personality in the first half of the 20th century. Came from a very privileged background. He went to study law in the United Kingdom. And when he went back to then the British Mandate of Palestine, he became part of the British administration. He was in fact the highest ranking Palestinian in the Mandate administration. He was a lawyer. And then in the 40s, he became he participated in the Palestinian attempt to avoid the Jewish independence, to avoid the creation of the State of Israel. He opened up an office in London, which was called the Arab Office. And from there, he tried to convince the British government, Ernest Bevin, and other ministers to not create a Jewish state, to stay in Palestine and to be more friendly towards the Arabs. And as we know, a state of Israel was finally, ultimately established. Right after the war, in 1949, as we say, he was a very wealthy Palestinian man, and he saw the condition of the Palestinian refugees. Now, back then, in 1949, we have to consider that those Palestinians who became refugees were indeed very similar to what we imagine to be refugees. They lived in tents. They were needy of some help, some humanitarian help, of food, of shelter. And he saw their condition, and he said to himself that he must help them. So how did he plan to help them? He planned, his vision in his mind was to create some kind of villages, agricultural villages along the River Jordan. Remember that after the end of the war in 1949, both banks of the River Jordan were under Jordanian rule, the East Bank and the West Bank. And his vision was to build agricultural communities, if you want, a little bit similar to the kibbutzim or to the moshavim, the Israeli version. And there he wanted to resettle some of the refugees. So take those falachim, those falach, those people, Palestinians who were used to cultivate the land, build them new houses and give them new plots of land. They can renew their lives and reintegrate them into the economy, give them back their dignity, etc., etc. Everything that we think that refugees want. This is the dream of every refugee, I think, in the world, that someone will take care of him, give him a new house, give him a new way of, make his living and be able to sustain his family, etc., etc. So this is what he's doing. In the book, we detail this. It's a very interesting story. He digs for water. The first thing that he tries to achieve is to have water. You need clean, fresh water if you want to have an agricultural village. And he's very successful eventually because the place where he builds his village is very close to the Dead Sea, somewhere near today's Jericho. The area is very rich in all kinds of minerals, so the crops of vegetables and fruits is very good. So it's a success. He manages to build an exemplary village, and few families, Palestinian families who were refugees, are resettled there. Everything is happy. He builds a swimming pool. And people from all over the world, the New York Times calls him an Arab Moses for bringing his people out of the misery or or towards freedom, and everything seems to be perfect. But only one group of people is unhappy with what's happening. And can you imagine who is that group? So that group is the Palestinians themselves. So in spite of the fact that Musa Alami himself is a Palestinian, was a Palestinian, a nationalist one, who was very adamant in his anti-Zionist and anti-Israeli feelings. Nonetheless, Palestinians and refugees themselves saw him as a traitor, saw him as a Zionist, Israeli, American, British, imperialist, collaborator, a traitor. And why is that? Because for them, from the first moment, we're talking about 1949, the only option, the only valid solution to the refugee problem was for them to go back to what has become the State of Israel. So he offered them new life, he offered them dignity, he offered them some sort of prosperity, certainly in respect to what they had, but this is not what they wanted. What they wanted was the political. So what they wanted to solve, or the humiliation for them, wasn't necessarily the fact that they were sitting in tents or that they had very little to eat or to earn. No, that they could have sustained. For them, the biggest humiliation was that they lost their previous lands to the Jews and that the state of Israel was established. So when they had the chance, so as I said, some refugees indeed went there and worked together with Alami, but from the first moment, it was considered like a treason. And indeed, in 1955, at a certain moment, when Musa Alami himself went to London, again in one of his trips to raise more funds, thousands of Palestinian refugees came from the refugee camps of Jericho, and this is something that he details in his autobiography that was published in the 70s. And they simply stormed the refugee, the new village, that famous Alami village. They stormed it, they put it on fire, they hurt people, they tried to rape the women. Now, just let us be clear, the attackers are Palestinian, and the people who are being attacked are Palestinians as well. So Palestinians attack Palestinians, no Israelis, no Jews are there, no United Nations, nobody there. And the only reason they attack their fellow brethren, their fellow Palestinians, is that they think that bringing or resettling them, reintegrating them into new life, into the economy, is an act of treason. So besides being a very interesting story, I think that there's a very important lesson here. The issue of the refugees is not a humanitarian one. Sometimes Palestinians claim that for so many years, they have to suffer these conditions of life. And in Gaza and in Lebanon and in other places, they describe their difficulties, etc., etc. But this is not the case. They had dozens, by now I can say dozens of opportunities to be resettled. Israel, after the 1967 war, offered them more than once to be resettled. Even more recently, Japan and other countries offered them to be resettled. But this is not what they want. What really bothers them is not the humanitarian condition of their life, but the fact that the state of Israel is next to them. What they really want is to go back to their old homes. As we know, most of those homes are not really there anymore, to their plots of lands, whatever they consider them to be. In their minds, there was a paradise, a Palestinian paradise before the state of Israel was created. And as we say in the book, for them, return is not only a geographic return, for them it is a return in time, to a time before the state of Israel was created. So this is the heart of the matter. It's not a humanitarian issue, and it's not a legal issue. The most important thing for them is the political issue, bringing back the situation to where it once was, in their view, to be a paradise. So that's the story of Musa Alami. And I want to touch, perhaps briefly, and if you want, we can go into that more deeply in the questions, but I would like to give you some kind of a overview of what we found regarding the peace process. Sorry, because sometimes when you tell these stories, people tell you, okay, that was in the 50s and the 60s. The PLO and the Palestinians have changed their mind. They are open to negotiations. They're open to, as Saib Arikat once said, that they have made their historic compromise. So as Einat said, unfortunately, this is not the case. We were very happy if that would be the case. And I think both of us think that the conflict could have been solved. But when we looked into the last decade, or actually 2 last decades, we found a very interesting trove of documents, which is called the Palestine Papers. Now, if you remember, the Palestine Papers were published about a decade ago by Al Jazeera and The Guardian, Al Jazeera and simultaneously The Guardian in the United Kingdom. And that was about 1,700 documents, inner documents, Palestinian documents in English, because these were people working with Saib Arikat. Saib Arikat, who's now in critical condition in an Israeli hospital, was the main negotiator. So he was the person involved in negotiations. He was the one who was dealing with the Americans and Israelis. And these were inner documents of how the Palestinians were thinking about their views. Some of it was very deep. Sometimes they really thought about their whole ethos and narrative. And sometimes it was more about wording and how to phrase certain issues, but there was a connection. So they always kept their eyes on their goal. And what we found in those documents was, to be honest, astonishing. First of all, the Palestinians are dead serious when they talk about the right of return. As Einat said, I think most of the think tanks, the books, the politicians who deal with the conflict tend to think about this issue as not very important. If it's really not that important, how come we found so many instances and so many discussions about the issue of return? They are very serious. I'll give you another example. They commissioned, the Palestinian PLO, they commissioned a research, a demographic research of the capacity of the state of Israel to absorb Palestinian refugees. Now, the numbers are staggering. You would imagine, and I think Ehud Olmert or even Ehud Barak, we're talking about something like 5,000 refugees who would be able to somehow symbolically return. The Palestinians speak in those documents between 600,000 Palestinians who want to return and 2 million Palestinians who want to return. So this is the estimate of the PLO. The PLO estimates that millions of Palestinian refugees would like to exercise their right of return, which, as Einat said, does not exist, but this is their estimate. So it's not about a symbolic return. It's not about these, 5,000, just a symbolic act of signing some kind of an agreement. No, the Palestinians themselves are talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of refugees. And we all understand that the meaning of such a massive influx of Palestinian refugees into Israel, the actual meaning is the end of the state of Israel as a Jewish state. I'll give you just couple of more examples. Saib Arikat himself never says, well, in Israel, and I think perhaps in Switzerland as well, there's a phrase, a catchphrase saying, 2 states for 2 people, right? So the idea was that Israel remains the nation state of the Jewish people, and the Palestinians will have their own state, the nation state of the Palestinian people. Now, the Palestinians don't use this phrase, and they do it deliberately. And in the documents, we found why. They don't use this phrase because they don't recognize Israel as being a Jewish state, the nation state of the Jewish people. They use a different phrasing, and I urge you to look it up because they always use the same phrasing. They use the phrase 2 states living peacefully side by side. So it sounds perfect, right? 2 states living peacefully side by side. But for them, the state of Israel would not be the nation state of the Jewish people. Everything is connected, because if they recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, they understand that they can't demand a massive influx of refugees. That is the reason that they don't use that phrase. For them, Israel would be a state, as Einat just said. There would finally be 2 Arab states or 1 Arab state, but they don't recognize the fact that Israel would stay as it is today, the Jewish state or the nation state of the Jewish people. So in those documents, they're really a trove of very interesting documents. We analyze them, we give examples, and it's a whole worldview of the Palestinians, which unfortunately have not done yet their historical compromise. They still don't recognize the Jewish right to self-determination, and the embodiment, or if you want, the manifestation, the clearest manifestation of that issue is their demand for a return and the perpetuation of the refugee problem.
I wish to thank you very much, both Einat and Dr. Adi. And I would like to ask a few questions in order to further elaborate on what you're saying. Basically, what you're saying is that the Palestinian people have not assimilated politically the present situation after 72 years and are still dreaming of the disappearance of the state of Israel. Can we say that the problem of Europe is that they are not reading the map, and therefore Europe is not on the subject, and they are trying to put pressure and to do initiatives which are beyond the subject, and in which case, how can we render Europe cognizant, even Switzerland, of this situation? Your book naturally is an excellent first step, but how can we build on it?
So fundamentally, the analysis of Palestinians, and it is still the dominant analysis in the Arab world, even if it's beginning to change in some places, the analysis of Palestinians and Arabs and even Muslims with respect to the Jews is that the sovereign Jewish state, that the state of Israel is a foreign presence. And because it's foreign, it's temporary. So Israel is traditionally compared to the Crusaders who existed temporarily and were thrown out, to the French in Algeria, to the British, even to the Ottomans. But the message is very clear, and this is the dominant narrative and analysis across the Arab world. Israel is a foreign plant. This is why it's also called colonial and all that. It doesn't belong. It's not from the region. Sure, Jews can live in the Middle East as a minority in Arab countries, but a sovereign Jewish state is an imperial, colonialist, foreign implant, which means, therefore, if this is the Arab and Palestinian analysis, then the action is very clear. Fight, remove this foreign implant, because sooner or later, any foreigner met with resistance leaves. And that's why we have conflict, because their response to the efforts to establish the state of Israel is to push us out, because as far as they're concerned, we're a foreign implant in the region. And the right of return and all of that are ways, they're symptoms of this fundamental idea. And in many ways, we'll only have peace once this narrative changes, once a majority, or at least a significant minority of the Arab world no longer views Israel as a foreign colonial imperialist implant in the region. We're seeing some hopeful changes of that narrative in the Gulf, but we still have a way to go. Now, you're absolutely right that Europe has been or has accepted in part this Arab-Palestinian narrative that Israel is a foreigner, but I will say that more than that, Europe, especially in the present, is guilty of a phenomena that we've termed in the book, it's a word I invented, West-plaining. West-plaining is a combination of West and explaining, and it means when Western diplomats, Swiss diplomats are great West-plainers, when Western diplomats and journalists basically explain away Palestinians have just Palestine from the river to the sea, the right of return is sacred, Israel will one day disappear. And what do Adi and I hear from all these diplomats? The Palestinians are just saying that. They know it's not true. They know it's not going to happen. They don't take it seriously. And one of the things I'm most proud about our book is that we give Palestinians the respect of taking them seriously, that what they say is what they mean. And I think what Western diplomats and journalists don't do is give Palestinians that respect. And by saying that Palestinians are delusional, they know that the right of return is not going to happen, Western diplomats are showing a complete misunderstanding of the simple game of numbers. Our response to these diplomats is often open a map, because Palestinians look at the region and say, okay, we're seeing now what, 7 million Jews? They're surrounded by 500 million Arabs, most of whom think they're a foreign implant. They're surrounded by 1.5 billion Muslims who think the same. This is not going to last. So the Palestinian worldview is rational. They're not delusional. Palestinians believe that if they just wait long enough, fight hard enough, and resist as much as they can, Israel will disappear. It is a rational worldview. The only thing that can begin to change it is if the Arab world will begin to change. And this, as you mentioned, Bandar Ben Sultan, we are beginning to hear, especially from Gulf states, we're beginning to hear strong messages from the Arab world to the Palestinians, basically telling them it's over. We no longer need you as to spearhead the Arab Islamic civilizational battle against the Jewish foreigners, because we're actually not thinking of them as foreigners anymore. And I can share with you, Adi and I had a very frustrating meeting with, really in the heart of darkness. We were in Brussels and we met with a German diplomat, but who was an EU official, who was responsible for funding UNRWA. And EU is now the greatest funder of UNRWA. So really the person responsible for the Western indulgence of the Palestinian dream would be the subtitle of our book. And after Adi and I present to him the history for an hour, at the end of the talk, he says this, and he says it very, like at the pace that I'm going to do right now. He says, so you want to tell me that the reason we don't have peace is that the Palestinians still want all of the land? And Adi and I both went, yes. But it was amazing to see how this Brussels EU diplomat, who works with UNRWA all the time, couldn't fathom, couldn't believe that the reason we don't have peace is that Palestinians are serious about the idea of Palestine from the river to the sea.
I'd like to ask you another question.
I want to, can I add something?
Yeah.
I want to add something about your question of how can we perhaps change the European attitude. I think that what happened with Europe, perhaps beginning in the 70s and 80s, but certainly after the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 80s, I think the Europeans have started to, want to have their own independent foreign policy and to be very vocal. Certainly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they became the guardians perhaps of the Arab side. Nowadays, they're certainly taking a very pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian position towards our conflict. What I think and where I'm so that's not an optimistic view. And I don't know what will happen in the elections in the United States, but under the Trump administration, it was even worse. So if Trump did something, even if it was good, the Europeans took exactly the opposite position. So there was no kind of way to, leverage or find some kind of rationality. If Trump says something against UNRWA, the Europeans were there to say UNRWA is good. Okay, why I'm optimistic? Because now we're seeing, continuing what Einat said, that what does it mean anymore to be pro-Arab? When the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan, and perhaps in the next few weeks, there will be more countries. So what is exactly, if the Arab states are in favor of having relations with Israel, regardless of the situation with the Palestinians, how can Europe be even more, so I think that this could be some kind of a shock to the European foreign policy, because they will see, as you say, that the train has long left the station, and they are staying with these old cliches of the 60s, of the 70s. So it's irrelevant anymore. And another point is that not as with the case of Sadat and King Hussein, the peace treaties that Israel signed in the 70s and the 90s with Egypt and Jordan, now these countries are telling them, that's it. We have been doing the wrong thing for 72 years. Sadat did not tell the Palestinians to change course or that they were wrong for so many years. Now it's the first time that they're talking about the entire conflict, and they're saying, okay, we can cooperate with the Jews. We don't have to fight with them anymore. I think it would be really ridiculous if after more countries, more Arab countries will have relationships with the state of Israel, then the Europeans will represent whom exactly? So this is why I'm optimistic a little bit.
Another question I would like to ask is how many Arabs actually left in 1948? And I understood also from the book that the majority of them left, in fact, before the creation of the State of Israel, still at the time of the mandate. And is there another case in history where the descendants of refugees are still considered refugees?
So I will, Einat, do you want, or I will start? Okay, so about the numbers. During the war, which was about 1.5 years, yeah, that's the number. About 700,000 Arabs were displaced, which means that they either fled or were kicked out by Israeli army. And in fact, no Arab had to leave his house before the war began. So no Arabs had to flee or were displaced during the mandate. The Palestinian Exodus started after the decision, the partition plan in November 29th, 1947, when the war broke out, when the Palestinians attacked, they were called Arabs then, attacked the Jewish communities. And along the next 18 months, when Arab armies attacked the state of Israel on May 15th, 1948. Now, those were the numbers. About 2/3 of them, so 500,000, remained in the area of the mandate. So we have to remember that 500,000, right? 2/3 of the refugees stayed inside the mandate in what became either the West Bank, the Jordanian-controlled West Bank, or the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip. So they actually, if you look at the international, the international definitions, they are not even refugees because they haven't crossed an internationally recognized border. The rest of them, 200,000 or 250,000, reached the East Bank, meaning the Kingdom of Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. So these are the numbers. What makes the Palestinian case very unique is that they are the only, first of all, they're the only group of people who are still refugees from the 40s. There is no other case of refugees from the 40s. And unfortunately, there were tens of millions of refugees. Europe was devastated after World War II. We had tens of millions of refugees, some of them, of course, Jews, but not only. You had Germans, Ukrainians, Polish, Soviet. So you had refugees all over Europe. You had tens of at least 12 or 15 million refugees in South Asia when the partition of India occurred. And so the number of refugees was huge. The only group of people who are still refugees from that period is the Palestinians. We tried to explain earlier the reason. The reason is that it's political. They were trying to achieve a political target to undo the state of Israel. So as long as they don't succeed, we have this problem. So it's not a coincidence. It's not a miracle that we have Palestinian refugees. The reason is that they didn't succeed in their target. Einat, would you like to say something about the descendants, or?
Sure. So something about the descendants, because especially UNRWA and the Palestinians like to play with it. As Adi mentioned, the mere existence of refugees as a result of war is normal. The 20th century and its transition from empire to nation states created hundreds of millions of refugees, pretty much on all continents. They're not refugees today. Their descendants are not refugees today. Why? Because basically the message throughout the 20th century to refugees was tough. It's tragic. You may have lost your home. Many have lost their lives, but you move on. Refugees did not have right of return. They did not sit in camps for decades waiting to get back their homes. No, the message for all refugees, including Jewish refugees, whether from Europe or from Arab countries, was wherever you go, build your future. You don't go back. That's it. If you go back, it will restart the war. The borders are the borders. It may not be fair. You did it. You don't have your house. War is not fair, but we're moving on. If we want to have peace, we need to look to the future rather than to go back and redo the war. The only people who were allowed basically to redo the war are the Palestinians. After the war, an organization called UNRWA, UNRWA, was established for the Palestinians, a temporary organization. Now, that was not special. We tell in the book about Koreans who got UNCRA. Now, UNCRA settled the Koreans from the north and the south within a few short years with less money than UNRWA had. And look at South Korea today. It could have been the Palestinians. They did not have a right of return and they're not sitting in camps. The Palestinians were given UNRWA. UNRWA recently celebrated 70 years of existence. It declared so proudly. This should have been a shameful moment because UNRWA, after 70 years, is still a temporary organization, which was supposed to achieve its goal in several years. But UNRWA, because of the West basically caving into Arab pressure, was sustained as a temporary organization that registers the Palestinian refugees as refugees from a decade after decade, generation after generation. This is unique. Now Palestinians or UNRWA, Swiss officials are very good at doing that. They'll tell you, no, there are other conflicts where descendants also get to be refugees. Yes, there are some conflicts in Afghanistan and other places where a second generation might get to be a refugee. In very rare cases, the third generation. But first of all, it's not automatic. In UNRWA, it's automatic. You're born, you're a refugee. For other refugees, it's not automatic. They're actually looking to see if they deserve to be called refugees. Not automatic. And most important, the other refugee agency, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees that deals with all the other refugees in the world, actually makes an effort to end the refugee status. UNRWA doesn't do that. And just so you get a sense of the absurdity, the idea of being a refugee, a perpetual refugee, generation after generation, is the most important thing in the Palestinian identity. But in practice, it's a very small problem. Mentally, it's a huge problem. Practically, it's a small problem. Why? Because 40% of those whom UNRWA registers as refugees live in the West Bank and Gaza. If you live in Ramallah and you were born in Ramallah, you're not a refugee from Palestine, period. The other 40% are citizens of Jordan. Jordan gave them citizenship when it annexed the West Bank. So they're not citizens, they're not refugees. If people are citizens of a country, they're not refugees. The other 20% are supposedly living in Lebanon and Syria, but we know from recent census data that most of them left. Many of them became citizens of other countries, maybe even in Europe, in America, and Canada. They are not refugees. The actual number of those who could really be called refugees, according to international standards, is 20, 30,000 who are living in Syria and Lebanon, who are the original refugees from the war, who did not get citizenship, who became refugees in another country. You can also give maybe their descendants in Syria and Lebanon refugee status. But at the end of the day, we're talking about 200, 300,000 people. That's it. And that's a relatively small refugee issue to resolve.
I would like to ask you another question, but first say, by UNRWA criteria, I'm a refugee because my mother was born in Egypt and was thrown out in 1948. In fact, she came to Israel before, but nevertheless, so I'm considered a refugee.
Hundreds of millions of people across the world would be refugees.
Absolutely. But I think we can mention also that I think 900,000 Jews of Arab countries left also in similar circumstances. They were absorbed in Israel and in other places in the world. And can we consider it as a balance, an exchange of population as happened in Moravia? And secondly, I would like to know if we look at the substance of the plan, of the American plan, which was declared in January of this year, without the personalities, I mean, without the politics of the United States of this week. But if we look at the substance, is that substance going in line with your way of thinking in the depth of the matter? And is that one way to solve the problem? And the last question is one of our audiences asked, is the law voted in Israel in 2018 on the nation state an effective manner of preventing the risk of loss of sovereignty of the Jewish people on Israel?
So I'll start perhaps with the Jews from Arab countries, and Einat will continue. So yes, there were about 1 million Jews living in Arab countries before 1948. And as we know, now there are none or very small communities in Morocco, a few thousand, in Iran, a few thousand. And yes, many of them were forced. Some of them physically were expelled, taking them to the port with one suitcase and $200. And others in, let's say, more indirect ways of making their life miserable by, kicking them out of their jobs, freezing their bank accounts, and otherwise making their lives miserable. And the numbers indeed are quite similar. So 700,000 Arabs had to leave this country, Israel, and about 900,000 Jews eventually had to leave the Arab world. We indeed give this example in the book as an example of this transfer of population. So there was nothing unique or nothing very interesting or special in the Palestinian case. By now, the Palestinians talk about themselves as the worst tragedy that humanity ever knew. So we give the example, which is very near because we're talking about the Middle East, of the Jews who had to flee places where they lived. If you look, for example, about the community in Baghdad, the community in Iraq is much before Islam and Muhammad came to there, and Morocco and Yemen, all these communities are much more ancient than Islam. So they're certainly indigenous and they're certainly from there. There is a big difference, or perhaps a few big differences. First of all, the Jews of Arab countries were peaceful citizens, or peaceful residents at least, of those countries. They didn't do anything for their host countries to kick them out. Here, in the case of the war of 1948, there was a war. These Palestinians were a side in the war. Some of them, perhaps some of them were civilians, but they were part of the war. What could explain the expulsion of so many people who were simply peaceful citizens? So this is a very big difference between the two cases. And another issue for me personally, I would like people to come to the state of Israel out of their wish and voluntarily. So I can't say that I'm very happy about this exchange of population. So one side is part of the war, what happened here with the Palestinians, and another side is a huge abuse of human rights against Jews. So it's not exactly the same thing as far as I see it.
I'll add to that and then go to the American Peace Plan. It's very important that the message be, when we speak of Jews from Arab countries, which, as Adi said, it wasn't in the course of war. This is not like the Pakistan-India border when there was partition and a mass exchange of population in the course of the partition. This was after, and the thing is this, even when it happened to Muslims and Hindus, the message to everyone, whether it was fair or not fair, was move on. So the idea is the Palestinians need to hear the same message. Like you said, Jews built their lives. Yes, it was not fair that they were thrown out, but yes, they moved on. They built thriving lives in Israel and in Europe and in North America, and that's it. There's no right of return. So it should be very clear that there's no kind of equivalent or transference. Everybody, whether it was fair or not fair, got the same message, which was move on. Now, as to the American Peace Plan, the important aspect is that on this issue, the American Peace Plan goes further and shows a better understanding than all previous efforts before, in understanding that Palestinians are not refugees, should not be considered as refugees, that there should not be in any peace plan the idea that they somehow possess a right of return into Israel. Previous peace plans spoke of symbolic returns. What we show in the book is that all of this needs to go away, because when Palestinians hear symbolic, they hear, okay, that's for everybody. So the message should be clear. The current plan is better than previous plans in sending the message, but of course we think that it doesn't go far enough, because it still says that UNRWA and all that should be dismantled at the end rather than at the beginning. And our argument is this: to get to peace, we need to start dismantling UNRWA now. The circular idea that you can first make peace, and once there is peace, you will dismantle UNRWA and end the refugee situation, it won't work. This is exactly our argument. It won't work because Palestinians, as long as they believe that they are refugees, generation after generation, possessing this so-called right of return into the sovereign state of Israel, we're never going to have peace. So the Palestinians first need to understand that they are not refugees, that there's no right of return, and only then is there even a chance that they will come to the negotiating table with realistic expectations that can really be negotiated. Now, the Israeli nation state bill is no protection for Israeli sovereignty. The only protection of Israeli sovereignty is and remains the Israeli military. And it's people, of course, the people that are willing to fight in the Israeli military, right? The tanks and airplanes are useless if there's no people who believe in the idea. But that's it. You can't make laws to make you sovereign. Israel is a sovereign country. It has an immigration law, which means it can decide who becomes a citizen and who doesn't become a citizen, which is like every other country. Switzerland has some of the toughest immigration laws in the world. Barely no one can become a Swiss citizen. And every country has the right, the sovereign right to determine who becomes a citizen. Israel has this sovereign right. And Palestinians are looking to for Israel to not have sovereignty. But at the end of the day, the main protection still, as long as we're still at war, the main protection for Israeli sovereignty is not a law, it's force, it's power.
I would like to ask two maybe last questions, if you allow, because there is a lot of questions which come in, but we have to select because we can't choose all. If not, we'll stay until midnight. One of them is est-ce que derrière cette forte mais illusoire volonté de retour se cache aussi la notion islamique de Dar el-Islam et Dar el-Harb? Is behind this strong illusion or voluntary illusion hides also the notion of Dar el-Islam and Dar el-Harb? And how can we change this attitude of the Palestinians, and what should Europeans ideally do? We touched already on that subject before. And somebody else asks, how could Switzerland more effectively support peace in the Middle East? And should not the Swiss government more vocally support the Abraham Accords? How can we change this attitude of the Palestinians, and what should Europeans ideally do? At least we go into what actions we have to take and where can we help?
Okay, so I'll start, and then Einat, perhaps you'll add. So starting with the issue of the Dar el-Islam, yes, of course. I mean, sometimes people say that we have to be very careful not to make this conflict a religious one. But that, I think, is ridiculous. This conflict had, from the beginning, religious aspects. I mean, when you look at the fact that Muslims and Arabs consider this entire area, and especially if you look into Jerusalem and the emphasis that they put on being responsible of Jerusalem, of course it has a religious aspect. And for the Arab civilization or for the Muslim civilization, even if not necessarily in the everyday life, perhaps they don't use those words from the Quran or whatever. Sometimes they do. I mean, at least look at the Palestinians. At least half of the Palestinians are effectively ruled by a very religious group, Hamas. And Fatah, which is supposed to be, or the PLO, which is supposed to be a more secular nationalist movement, also has very strong relations and very strong roots in Muslim thought. So pretending that this is some kind of a conflict between two, I don't know, Buddhist or whatever groups is ridiculous. Of course, this is a conflict between a Muslim group of people and the Jewish group of people. And you cannot ignore that fact. I mean, if these were two Muslim groups, the conflict would be very different. So of course, I think naturally, I think that the religious part or the religious aspect certainly has an influence. Now, I will just touch very generally to what we should do and the Abraham Accords. I think that the most important thing, that the obstacle that we have to overcome is Palestinian rejectionism. The most important issue is for the Palestinians to accept that the nation state of the Jews is going to stay. Once they accept this, all the rest is details. I mean, if you look, then you have the question of where exactly would the border be? Okay, that's a fair question. But until the Palestinians, I mean, if you are going to use that Palestinian people just to start another war again with Israel, just as Hamas is doing now in Gaza, there is no point of the whole thing. No sane Israeli leader will sign a peace agreement whose meaning is just giving the Palestinians more territory to be in a more favorable position to conquer Israel. I mean, this is where we are right now. The moment we will have a decision of the Palestinians that they are going to create their own Palestinian state for the future, for their own good, to go to universities, to create jobs, to live well, whatever, just like what we consider to be every normal other state, then all the rest is details. So this is the most important thing. How do we achieve it? Now, it's gonna be tough because as we're saying, there are civilizational issues. There are religious issues. It's not very easy, but we have to start somewhere. So I think that what's happening now with the Arab countries, and I'm following, you know, Arab analysts, etc., and they are saying that if Trump wins again, the Palestinians will have no other choice but to reconsider their position. Perhaps they will have to do it even if Biden wins. But the Palestinians have found themselves now in a corner that I don't remember. I don't think that they were in such a weak position. And this is exactly where they might, I mean, this is again, a place for optimism, where they might reconsider their position and say, okay, we're here without support. Yes, again, Europeans are still supporting them, but hopefully this will also change. So this is exactly the path. Isolating the Palestinians, sending a very clear message that they are doomed. If they are continuing to wish for the destruction of the state of Israel, nobody is going to support them. And this is exactly the message that has to be conveyed to the Swiss government and to every other European government.
First on the issue of Islam, there's no doubt that this is the language, certainly in recent decades, in which the conflict is couched. But I believe that religions are changeable, or let's say they tend to be interpreted and reinterpreted. What we are seeing now in the Gulf is fascinating. You are seeing Arab leaders and religious leaders reinterpreting Islam to say that the Jews belong here. I recently just exchanged with Adi, we always follow this with interest, that some Saudis are beginning to say that perhaps it's time to remind Muslims that according to Islamic tradition, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is not even in Jerusalem, it's in Saudi. Now, I was not aware of this issue, but Adi said that this is a long-running question in Islam. Where is the mosque? Traditionally, it's been placed in Jerusalem because of the interests against the Crusaders, against the Jews. But look, they are willing to use the language of Islam now for the purpose of peace. So for me, the fact that religion plays a factor does not mean that we are condemned to war. I do believe that religious language could also be used to justify the making of peace. And that's why I don't determine it in one side or another. And and I think really like Adi, our recommendations are very simple. The Palestinians need to hear a clear message from the Arab world and the West. It's going to be a tragedy if at the moment that some Arab voices are telling the Palestinians, move on, you need to have normal and realistic expectations. If at that moment you're going to have Western countries like Switzerland continuing to feed the Palestinian belief that Israel is temporary and needs to disappear. So I know it sounds tough because so many have been used to thinking of Palestinians as these blameless victims. Once you understand that Palestinians are agents of history, they're a side to the conflict, they have goals which include not having Israel, then I think we can have a joint Arab-Western effort that shows Palestinians that they need to make peace next to Israel and not instead of Israel. That's the message that they need to be hearing morning, afternoon, and evening.
Thank you very much. That's very important. Nous voulions que vous veniez tous les deux au groupe parlementaire à Berne, des parlementaires proches de l'affaire israélienne. À l'époque, ça n'a pas fonctionné, mais on va essayer d'organiser une date dès qu'il y a les possibilités de voyager, parce qu'on est un tout petit peu plus difficile ici en matière de Covid, mais ça va passer. Et on voudra effectivement que vous ayez la possibilité de rencontrer nos parlementaires, notre département fédéral des affaires étrangères, et leur faire comprendre les réalités de la chose. Et j'aimerais vous remercier tous les deux, Einat Wilf et Adi Schwartz, pour une présentation très intéressante et très éclairante. Et je recommande à tout le monde de lire ce livre que je trouve un livre culte dans ce sujet et qui va rester comme un des livres fondamentaux dans le sujet. C'est tout à votre honneur. Et j'aimerais aussi dire à tous nos spectateurs que vous pouvez voir en différé ou passer à vos amis pour les recommander à voir sur notre YouTube. C'est marqué dans le Q&A où vous pouvez vous connecter pour pouvoir cette démarche. Et je voulais aussi remercier Anaël pour l'organisation et un très, très, très grand merci à Nina Moldauer qui a assuré une traduction fantastique. C'est une amie qui a toujours été de notre côté, elle est toujours de notre côté. Elle est une grande militante de la cause et je la remercie avec tout mon cœur. Merci beaucoup. Et puis, je remercie tout le monde et je vous souhaite une excellente soirée. Et merci beaucoup encore une fois, Einat et Adi. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous.